So I am unexpectedly back with this 5E8 low-power Tweed Twin Mojotone build. I thought it was all done from my perspective, and last night I played it for about 4 hours, and today I used it for my live stream, and it had been on for about an hour before I started the 2.5-hour live stream, so about 3.5 hours, no issues whatsoever. I turned it off, and I had a Strat with a problem with the output jack I wanted to check, and I turned it back on, and it started making a terrible, terrible hum. I'm not sure what the cause is, but I can't return it like this. One thing I noticed was that this grid stopper here was very, very close to this lead, which is the raw bias, which is technically the same as right here, but that this side of this resistor was very close to the AC coming in from the power transformer. I'm really close. So I have moved these lugs of this tube socket farther away. I don't think that's the issue, but let's find out. But it's just unusual for an amp to go from sounding great for an extended period of time to instantly sounding bad next time it's powered on. I suspect it might be one of the output tubes. I've got it with my current limiter. I'm going to power it on, and I'm ready to switch it off as soon as I hear the sound. But I'm going to be watching the tubes to see if I see any telltale activity. So let me get a sip of my coffee and brace myself. And here we go. All right, that all sounds fine. Let me bring the volume up. I had the volume up a bit, and I turned it down before I did this because I wanted to narrow it down. See, now it's acting just fine. It was a really bad, distressing level of hum, and it is not happening now at all. It's possible that there was an arc from this point here on this resistor, which is the bias tap AC, to pin 5 here, which is the grid of this tube, and that it was just jumping over. I could see a gap between them, but it was very narrow. Like I said, I moved that. I'm not going to put it back just in case that causes a big problem. But now, aside from the residual hum it already had, which is mostly due to the ground bus wire here across the pots versus how Leo grounded these, and I've spoken to the owner about that. That's in his wheelhouse if he should feel the need to get it as quiet as possible. I'm not having that big hummy issue. And it was instantaneously, and the amp was cooler when I had the issue than it was just a minute ago when I powered on here. When the problem was happening, we had 115 volts coming out of the wall. Right now we've got 117. Let me double check the DCR just in case something has changed, and then I'm going to power it back on and check the bias voltage per tube. I don't want to give this back if there's a chance of it making that awful sound. The builder of this amp did a fantastic job for a kit build, but if it has a problem like that, I am probably better suited to diagnose it. So let's see here. From here to here, 53.3. It's about where it ended up last time. And here, 48.9. So that's all within a fraction of an ohm from where I measured it when I did the bias. All right, so with the amp in standby and the current limiter off now, because I wanted to get the full thing. Yesterday or the day before when I set the bias on this, I had about negative 42 at the grids. That was with a higher wall voltage, like 124, 125. Now we're at 116. Negative 41.2, so that's about the right change. I'll take it out of standby. It's right at negative 41. So not a huge difference. And the plate voltage has dropped a little bit, of course. And that would indicate, that's scaling together along with the decreased mains voltage. So I'm going to go through here and move every wire again. I've already done this. I didn't show this in the previous video because it's pretty boring. I'm not going to show all this unless I find a culprit. But is there something causing that hum? It's very possible that there was just an arc developing because the amp had been on for many, many hours from this resistor to that grid there. But that would be unusual. Unusual does not mean impossible. Anyway, I'll resume this if I find a culprit, some wire that causes a noise, but I'm not going to subject you to that whole process. Well, frustratingly, despite much poking and prodding, the only thing I can find wrong with the amp is, again, this 6L6 is a little bit microphonic and rings out with certain frequencies in the amp. And that's also the tube where I suspect that the problem might have been an arcing, and it might have started just from an initial power surge, because it happened as soon as it powered on, from this AC connection for the bias tap directly to pin 5 of this socket, because there's just not much space. And the reason there's not much space there is that this board holder is mounted out quite a bit from the chassis, because the output transformer is on the other side, and I'm sure the other side of that output transformer has got at least caps, nuts, and screws, as opposed to a vintage one, which would be held on by machine screws, which would kind of go into the back of this board, but the back of this board would still be closer to the chassis. Let me move the camera, you can see what I'm talking about. All right, here you can see there's a pretty big gap from the chassis to the backing board and the main board. It's about an inch. On an old one, a real Fender, that would be pretty much up against that back board, and there'd be much more space between here and here. I'll show you that in a bit. From looking behind here, I don't see the screws that are holding the output transformer coming out from the caps nuts any more than I do here on this one that's holding the choke. So there should be room for this board to go back a little bit. It's out quite a bit. Maybe that needs to be changed. Let me get a different angle and show you what I think might have been happening. Right in here, this end of this resistor was very, very close to this end of this resistor. And, it was, you can see all the flex in the board there. It's possible that with heat it expanded out and they were almost touching, or maybe they were touching for a moment. But if you have raw AC on this grid, that would explain that nasty noise I heard. At this point, I don't know for sure that it is that, because I'm certainly not going to bridge that, because that could easily kill a 6L6. I know that that is one of the ways to make this thing make a terrible, terrible sound, but I don't know that that was it. What I'm going to do right now is see if I can tighten this and move this whole thing closer to the chassis. He may have a spacer behind here. I'm going to get my mirror out and take a peek, but I'll have to do that with the amp off and discharged and the camera moved. So let me get set up for that real fast. All right, so this screw and this nut don't seem to be attached to the chassis. And the other side of this board is where the output transformer is. And I suspect that this screw and nut are just holding the top board to the backer board as opposed to securing this end of the board. And I did not expect that, so I did not see that when I was doing my initial inspection. And that's one of those things that I wouldn't look for that, because why would that be the case? That's such an unusual thing. Now, but right behind this is the output transformer. It's in this area. So there is no hole in the chassis here for a screw head to be, and there's not really room for it. Let's see where the transformer stops. It's all in this area. So basically, what the owner needs to do, and I'm going to let the owner do it because he's built the rest of this, he needs to take this out. He needs to drill a hole right around here through the chassis, and there's a gap there between the choke and the output transformer. And it's best to do that with the chassis pulled and possibly removing the output transformer to get enough space to get a drill in there. But this board is not supported at this end. I can move the entire board and the screw moves with it. And there's just not much space between these components and this grid stopper. And if it were secured back to the chassis like that, I'm really pushing, then there'd be plenty of clearance. I thought there was just enough. I wasn't thrilled with that, but I didn't want to call that out just because it wasn't to my standards. But it turns out it's worse than just an aesthetic choice. It's not secured at all. It really should be up against the chassis as much as possible. And this is a problem I've run into with other Mojotone builds where they don't drill through the chassis. They don't have instructions for how to secure the backing boards and the boards to the chassis in their amps, in their kits. And I've seen some Mojotone kits where there were no connections at all from the board to the chassis. Everything is just floating and suspended by the wires. And I think I've even seen that said in their instructions that that's acceptable. It is not. So this is insufficient, and the owner of this amp, who's done all this great work, needs to take the time to redo this in this area so that there is a connection at this end from board to chassis. It could even be over here if necessary, wherever he can find a space just to get this secure and to move these components farther from here. I'm increasingly confident that that was the problem, that as things got hot, this board just moved, because it'll move, and I could make it happen right now. I could force the issue. I'm not going to. That's just way too much movement, and as things get hot, things do move. But this needs to be back as far as possible. He may have some wires bunched up behind here. I could do this for him, but I would have to undo a lot of this, and that becomes a large bill. Based on the work he's done everywhere else, he's perfectly capable of doing this now that I've discovered that this is an issue. And I'm glad it happened here where I could test things. I'm sorry it happened at all. I know there was more clearance earlier, last time I looked at this, than there was when I opened this up again. So I think this board did shift maybe as it got hot, because it had been on for several hours and had been sounding good for those hours, but that's no guarantee, sadly. So I think the mystery's been solved. Just in case, I'm going to test this another several hours tonight and do heat cycles so it goes from cold to hot and back. Right now, the tubes are just barely warm to the touch. I'm going to power it on and see if the problem stays gone. And while that warms up, I want to remind you that you've got to have found a lot of ways to mess up an amp before you can recognize the sound of different ways amps can mess up. So this sound was something as drastically wrong as if something was wrong with a grid, seriously wrong with the grid. So that led me right here. Does that sound like I'm saying I'm so wise and experienced? Well, yeah. If you fuck up enough amps, you learn what the various ways to fuck up an amp sound like, and you tend not to want to do that in the future. So I know what that sound is because I've made that stupid mistake in the past. No one starts perfect. I'm not saying I'm perfect now, but I never want to make the same mistake twice. Only new and exciting mistakes.